South London post-punk band The Sound are a bit like the sound in that old philosophical question about a tree falling in the woods. What happens if no one's actually around to hear it? The answer in their case is they became one of the great cult bands of their era. So few people, certainly today, seem to have even heard of The Sound, let alone have any familiarity with their songs. But whilst their audience was small and they're still very much a cult concern, the quality, the passion, the tension and the conviction at the heart of The Sound's music is what's resonated down the decades, leaving them as one of post-punk's best kept secrets and architects of some of its most emotionally stirring moments. Welcome to 2020 Sound, the channel where we take a look back at some of the more overlooked aspects, the more cult aspects of indie and alternative rock history. If that sounds like something you'd like to watch more videos about, then do please give us a subscribe. Thanks to the likes of Q magazine publishing a 100 greatest albums of all time list what felt like every 3 months or so growing up, reading the music press in the 90s, you quickly got a sense of what was part of the rock and roll canon, the 5-star classics from each era that were generally the most universally revered, at least as far as British music magazines were concerned. Which made it all the more eye-catching on those rare occasions when you'd come across a 5-star review of a reissue that you'd never heard of before. And the one that always stuck with me was From the Lion's Mouth by The Sound. I can't remember what magazine it was, it might have been Mojo, but this was back in 2002 and I remember seeing the review and the album artwork, which was instantly striking, conjuring this sort of biblical Daniel in the Lion's Den imagery, and it got the full 5 stars and a suitably effusive write-up. And I just remember coming away from it thinking, someone's given 5 out of 5 to this album from 1981 that I've never heard of by a band that I've never heard of. I should definitely check that out at some point. At some point turned into maybe 17 years later, when streaming services and algorithms made it much simpler to explore music. But it had stuck in the back of my mind for that whole time. So when Spotify properly introduced me to the group via the song Winning, the opening track on From the Lion's Mouth, I instantly remembered the band, the artwork and the review, and it opened the door to me delving further. And upon delving further, particularly through watching the documentary Walking in the Opposite Direction, it's apparent how singer Adrian Borland's battles with schizoaffective disorder and eventual suicide are intertwined with the history of the band, which gives their story this sense of tragedy. But the thing about Winning is it's so triumphant rather than tragic. What makes it so compelling is this sense of victory in the face of overwhelming obstacles. I love the sheer defiance of the song's chorus. I was gonna drown, then I started swimming. I was going down. Then I started winning. Lyrically though, across so much of their stuff, from I Can't Escape Myself, the very first song on their first album, 1980's Jeopardy onwards, it's very easy to read Borland's personal battles into his words. So many feelings pent up in here. Left alone, I'm with the one I most fear. But the band packed such a punch across their career that regardless of how much pain was in the lyrics at times, they play with such gusto that it never feels like the music wallows to me. The rhythm section of Mike Dudley on the drums and Graham Bailey on the bass propel the songs forward, and especially when you watch live footage from that time, give the band such energy. They're post-punks, but they often play with the amphetamine-fueled ferocity of the class of '76, as on the likes of Resistance on Jeopardy. Take some action and change my fate. Plus the keyboard and other instrumental parts by original member By Marshall and the late Colvin Mayers combine with Borland's guitar work to give the sound of The Sound a breadth that keeps the songs interesting. So there's a darkness to so many of these songs, as there was in so much of the music of that time, that's clearly informed by the health problems Borland was going through. But despite being so personal, the way he writes, a lot of it feels so relatable to whatever you as a listener may be going through in your own life, whatever struggles you may be enduring.
scratched away at the walls for years. All we've got to show is the dust on the floor.
Despite the darkness, the direction the music travels in over their albums feels so expansive, like a lot of their contemporaries at that time. It feels like a lot of those bands, the Bunnymen, Simple Minds, even U2, in their own individual ways, it's like they spent those early years of the 80s moving along paths out of the gloom so majestically embodied by Joy Division's albums towards something much more, certainly not light, but wide scale in terms of the mood and the sonic palette that they were painting with, so to speak. And the sound had one of the most interesting paths of all those bands. By the time of 1982's All Fall Down, this was infamously the album that led to them getting dropped, when their label pushed them to do something more commercial, and they responded by making an album that was considered far too weird and experimental. Weird and wonderful as the album is, it's still underpinned by great songwriting and performances. These are still recognisably rock songs at the end of the day. They're not avant-garde compositions, like Party of the Mind, for instance, is still an absolute banger. Perhaps it was too much for a Culture Club fan to take, but for anyone with a taste for indie and alternative stuff these days, there's so much on this record and all their records to enjoy. From the edgier grit of Jeopardy and songs like the pleading desperation of Missiles, right through even to some of the polished joyousness of something like Prove Me Wrong on their final album, 1987's Thunder Up. There's much to enjoy across their whole output, and it does of course beg the question, why didn't they make it big? Along with their contemporaries, the Chameleons, these two groups are probably the biggest question marks success-wise of that post-punk era. And strangely enough, there does seem to be some crossover in both bands' fan bases. There's a Facebook group, for instance, dedicated to both bands, and the sound was suggested as the subject for a future video in a few of the comments on a video I did on the Chameleons, which you can probably find somewhere up there if you're interested. Both carved comparable musical paths to their more commercially successful peers. Both wrote their share of soaring anthems, but neither attained the success of even the Bunnymen, let alone U2. In the Sound's case, there's probably a few things you can pin it on. They were initially signed to Corova, a label who boasted only one other act, wouldn't you know it, Echo and the Bunnymen, which in an article in The Guardian, journalist Dave Simpson suggested perhaps meant they received less attention than they should have from their employers, which perhaps led to their limited TV and radio play. Maybe I'm deluded, but to me the Sound had an array of anthems that could have easily become hits given the right exposure, from Contact the Fact, to In Suspense,
My head is feeling what my heart is beating, so far down there,
to Whirlpool,
Whirlpool, it takes the best.
and beyond. These guys couldn't help but write soaring, singable melodies. The documentary features a ridiculous story in which Mike Dudley actually broke his hand at the start of the band's European tour as a result of trying to demonstrate a karate chop, and the whole thing had to be cancelled, which is absurd, but Graham Bailey felt it derailed their momentum, which it no doubt did, so couldn't have helped matters. But no matter the reason why, as Adrian's father points out in the film, if they had made it big, it's unlikely Adrian would have been able to handle it given how bad his mental health became. Which is truly sad, because the man, at least as he was portrayed in the film, was clearly born to play. A dynamo who was always doing something musical. If he's in someone's living room and they've got a guitar, then he's playing that guitar. The kind of guy who's involved in recording and releasing an entire album while still at school. In fact, that's one of the coolest aspects of Adrian's story. The fact that his father, Bob, recorded the debut album by The Outsiders, Adrian's first group, the band that would morph into the Sound. He recorded it entirely at home on a second-hand 4-track. And not only is this album, 1977's Calling on Youth, considered to be the first self-released LP by a British punk band, but for a 70s suburban home recording, drum kit set up on the upstairs landing or whatever, it still sounds great and is a testament to the DIY punk spirit.
Are you prepared to submit to the old stranglehold?
Over 40 years on from the release of From the Lion's Mouth, whilst the sound didn't make as big of a splash as they would have liked at the time, the impact that they did make continues to ripple on well into the 21st century with every return to their records. And thankfully, YouTube clips capture for posterity some of the intensity of their live performances. The band that wrote Winning may not have won over the masses, but they undoubtedly won the hearts of a hardcore following and a place in history as proponents of some of the very best music of the 80s. So, are they post-punk's best kept secret? I'd say so. And everybody loves to hear a secret. So go tell a friend. How did you come across the sound for the first time? Let me know in the comments, and if you like this video and if you know someone else who may enjoy it, then do please give it a share. And if you'd like to watch more videos along similar lines about the more overlooked or the more cult corners of indie and alternative rock history, then do please subscribe.